Hello, welcome to another edition of Behind the Veil. We continue with our theme in the month of May, which is the church that Jesus built. So we are in part 2 of the series, and today we talked about the church, the place for sacrifice, or a place of sacrifice. So join us as we go into this and we further discuss this. But we've started on our main verse, which is Matthew chapter 16 verse 18, where it says, "You are Peter, a stone, and upon this rock," and we learned last week that the rock is revelation. The church is built on revelation. So today we're going to talk about the sacrifice, a church being a place of sacrifice or building in sacrifice. Stay tuned as we go deeper. So we started our study on a very popular part of the Bible, which is Abraham and Isaac. So we looked in Genesis chapter 22, reading from verse 1 to verse 5. And in verse 1 it says that later on God tested Abraham's faith and obedience. So we said that sacrifice tests our faith and obedience to God. In verse 2 it says, "Take your son, the one whom you love." So sacrifice, it always involves something that we cherish, we really love. Take the one that you really love and go to the land of Moriah. And there, I want you to go out there. So in verse 3, he says that the next morning Abraham wakes up and he chops some wood and he saddles up, and then he takes 2 servants and then he takes his boy to go up to Moriah. And what does it say in verse 4? And it's saying in verse 4, he had traveled 3 days. So it means that God had a very specific place for him to do this, because he traveled for 3 days. And then finally he told the servants, "Can you wait here as I go with the boy to go and worship?" Remember, he was about to sacrifice his son, but he said, "I am going to worship." That, we said, worship is actually a sacrificial thing, and we will talk later and expand on this more. We continued our study and examined another man of God who is very popular in the Bible, which is David. Now, there was a plague in Israel, and David was told to build an altar. So what does he do? So let's examine quickly. And in 2 Samuel chapter 24, reading from 18. And in verse 18, he says, "That day God came to David and said to him, 'Go and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite.' And so David went to do what the Lord had commanded him. In verse 20, it says that when he got there, now David is a king, so when Araunah saw him, he fell down. He fell onto the ground and he put his face in the dust. He was like worshiping, "Oh my Lord." And in verse 21, he is asking, why have you come to me? And he says, "I've come to buy your threshing floor so that I can build an altar to the Lord, so that the plague will stop." We said that sometime when there's problems in our lives, we need to start building altars. That is when God can hear us out. But in verse 22, we realize that Araunah wasn't interested in selling the land to his king. He wanted to honor him. He said, take everything. I don't want to, you can use whatever you want." But David replies in verse 23, and he says, he's saying that I will give it to you, in verse 23, "I will give it to you all, and may God accept your sacrifice." Now remember, he wanted to offer everything to him free. Then he said, "May God honor your sacrifice." We said that you cannot sacrifice something that does not cost you or belong to you. So it's right after that in verse 24, this is David, and this is powerfully, this is what he said. And he says, "No, I will not have it as a gift. Why? I will buy it, for I don't want to offer the Lord my God burnt offerings, that which has not cost me anything, or that have cost me nothing." So we said that sacrifice does cost us something. So our question to the church and to everyone is, if our Christianity is not costing us something, if our walk with God is not inconveniencing us, perhaps we are not that invested in. Whatever we are invested in will cost us. Even in investment, there's a principle, there's a capital. So you have to put something down. So maybe perhaps we have not put our life down yet. so it's not costing us. So finally, when David bought it and it cost him, verse 25 says this. It says, and David built an altar there to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And he says, and the Lord answered his prayer and the plague stopped. So we said that there may be a plague in your life, brother and sister. You need to start building an altar of sacrifice. It could be a prayer altar where you have to wake up at odd times, where you have to invest time on your knees. That is where God will listen and your plague in your life will stop. The reason why we share the story of Abraham and the story of David was to come to this point where we want to show God wanted to build a temple, but David wanted to build it, but God said, no, your hands are bloodied. I will let your son build it. But it's very interesting, the connection between the temple and even to Abraham. Now watch this. In 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1, and I'll read this. And it says, finally the actual construction of the temple began. Its location, now listen to this, very specific. Its location was in Jerusalem at the top of Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah again, where the Lord had appeared to Solomon's father David, where the threshing floor of Onan the Jebusite had been. David has selected it as the site for the temple. Now, this is the site where Abraham was about to sacrifice his son. This is the same site David bought the threshing field and he made an altar. So Solomon knew that this specific place is what my father desired, because the church or an altar is built on sacrifice. Remember in tabernacle, when there was an altar, that's where people brought the sacrifice. You don't kill the cattle or sheep in your home and come and tell the priest, I have done this. You bring your sacrifice at the altar God has chosen. So we were saying that in the church provides us that opportunity where we come and we offer ourselves to God. Then we looked at Philippians chapter 3 verse 7 and 8. And it says, and I'll read from verse 7, it says, but all these things that I once thought very worthwhile, now I have thrown them all away, so that I put my trust and hope in Christ alone. Verse 8 is very important. It says, yes, everything else is worthless when compared with the priceless gain of knowing Christ. Beloved, there may be something that you hold so dear to your heart, like Abraham held Isaac so dear. But until you count it all lost, like Paul said, you are not ready to sacrifice. So it says in verse 8 that I have put aside all else, counting it worth less than nothing, in order that I can have Christ. Until you get to that point, you're not ready to sacrifice. And then we personalized it. We said the church is a place of sacrifice, but the sacrifice begins with us. What kind of sacrifice am I talking about? Romans chapter 12 verse 1. A very interesting verse that I love so much. And it says in Romans chapter 12 verse 1, and so, dear brothers, I plead with you to give your bodies to God. We're not talking about lambs and cattle anymore. We're talking about our body. Our body, the sacrifice begins with us. And it says, let them be a living sacrifice. We are supposed to be a living sacrifice. What does that mean? That's an oxymoron. Living and sacrifice? That is an oxymoron. But what he's trying to say is, when Christ says, carry your cross daily, it means that you are dying to yourself, or dying to the things that you hold so dear daily for the sake of Christ. A living sacrifice. Those are the people who have first died to themselves that can build a church. So that's on a personal level. And in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 20, it tells us this. It says, what a foundation you stand on now, the apostles and the prophets. What do you mean by we stand on a prophet? Because we stand on their sacrifice. In the early centuries, they were being thrown to lions. Some were being crucified. They were being sawn into two. They sacrificed. That's why the church is standing on its feet. So it says, because it says the foundation you stand on now. the apostles and the prophets, they had put down sacrifices for you. But the main and ultimate sacrifice was Jesus, who is the cornerstone. And that's what we talked about in part 1. See, we are to build the church on sacrifice because those that have gone before us have built it on sacrifice. So we say the church, a place of sacrifice. Beloved, the church is your only opportunity, not only your main opportunity to show to God that you sacrifice to Him. So we say that the church offers us an opportunity for us to sacrifice our time, our energy, our efforts. That is what we talked about a church that builds on sacrifice. So we hope you've learned a lot from this. And as we continue on this series of the church that Jesus built, beloved, you will learn more. Now, if you want a full understanding, listen to the audio message on our SoundCloud and in our various WhatsApp distributions. Until then, we'll see you next time. God bless you and have a wonderful week.